So today I want to talk about the Cherokees and give you an overview of their history up to about 1865, but with a specific focus on Indian removal. And I do this to give you a more specific example. I mentioned Indian removal in the lecture on Andrew Jackson, but I wanted to talk about how it affected one specific tribe, and this was the tribe that was most famously affected by it. Not the only tribe, but the most famous one. So first of all, I want to start with the present, who the Cherokee people are today, because not only are they still around, but it is the most populous tribe in America. There are actually three federally recognized Cherokee tribes, and the fact that there are three instead of one is directly related to the forced migrations in the 1800s. There are two in Oklahoma. One is called the Cherokee Nation, and the other is called the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee Indians. And there's another one in North Carolina, and it's the biggest one is the Cherokee Nation. It has I've seen figures 250,000, 300,000, something around there, official tribal members, making it the biggest tribe in America. The other two have far fewer members, I think 14,000 or so for the Kituwa Band in Oklahoma, and a few thousand for the North Carolina Band. In addition to the officially recognized tribes, according to the U.S. Census, over 800,000 Americans believe that they have some Cherokee ancestry. That's really common where we are in the South, which is kind of the historic grounds of the Cherokee people. Black and white Americans believe that they have some Cherokee ancestry. But most of these people are not officially recognized as Indians. These are just people who think this is a part of their ancestral makeup. So the Cherokee are members of the Iroquoian language family. That means linguistically their language is related to the Iroquois language. And we think, well, there are two theories. One theory is that the original Cherokee were around the Great Lakes region, and the original Iroquois thousands of years ago were all around the Great Lakes region. And the Cherokee branched off around 1500 to 2,000 years ago and moved to their historic homeland, which is North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina. Another theory is that no, it's the opposite. The Cherokee and a group called the Tuscarora were also Iroquoian speaking, and all the other Iroquoian language groups started out in the southeastern United States, where the Cherokee were in historic times, and then the other groups moved north to the Great Lakes, the members of the Iroquois Confederacy. It's probably the former. It's probably that the Great Lakes is the original homeland. And the reason I say that is because Cherokee lore, Cherokee stories tell of a migration long, long ago from the Great Lakes region to their historic homelands in the Smoky Mountains area in the southeast. And so it just all kind of connects that way. So at least 1,000 years ago, the Cherokee were inhabiting North Carolina and these other states in the American Southwest. This is actually a picture of a place called Kituwa Mound, and this is, according to the Cherokee themselves, their ancestral homeland. This is the spot where they first settled after their great migration from the north, like I said, maybe 2,000 years ago. And this is hard for you to see, but it is a mound. It is not just a natural slope in the land. From where you're sitting, maybe you can't distinguish this, but somewhere around the middle of the picture, if you look very closely, you can see a line where the color of the grass changes subtly. And above this line, this is the mound. And originally it was much taller, but over the last couple of hundred years, it has been whittled away by farmers or whoever that took dirt and destroyed who knows how many countless artifacts. but we know it was much bigger 1,000 years ago when it was originally settled by the Cherokee. Another interesting thing about it is the Cherokee became a part of this Mississippian culture that built mounds and stuff like I talked about way back at the beginning of class with Cahokia. But they tended to put townhouses on top of the mounds rather than temples. And so this might have been an actual dwelling place for people to live and to sleep. Another interesting thing about it, if I remember correctly, and I'm pretty sure I do, this Kituwa Mound is in the present day boundaries of the reservation of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina. They bought it about 50 years ago. They bought the land and they decided not to do archaeological studies. They decided, because there are burials and things there, they decided, for the moment at least, they do some things, but they only do non-invasive stuff. In other words, they don't do any digging because they don't want to disturb it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I'm going to skip this for today in the interest of time. The green corn ceremony is common to all southeastern Indians and even northeastern Indians along the Atlantic coast, that part of the United States. And it's an annual sort of, here, I said I was going to skip it. No, I'm not skipping it. It's an annual ceremony to mark the first harvest of corn. And it involved some really interesting things, sacrificing the first fruits of the harvest, not just the corn, but the other plants and edible things that were grown. And by sacrificing these first fruits, this was meant to sort of cleanse them of sins and start a new year, in a sense. So it's kind of a harvest festival and New Year festival at the same time. And one really, really, really interesting thing about it, to me at least, they would build a fire in the center of 4 huge logs or timbers pointing in the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And this new fire they would extinguish all the other fires in their household. They would burn all the old items that were no good anymore and destroy them, and then use that fire, I think, to build the new fire. And then they would use the new fire to relight the fires in all their homes. This was very similar to an Aztec ceremony in central Mexico around 1500, 1300, which is probably pure coincidence, but I think that the similarity is very, very interesting. So, in the ancient times, hundreds of years ago, we know, because of Cherokee stories, that they were ruled by a priestly class, a hereditary class of priests called the Anikutani. And we know that about 300 years or so before European contact, which would be sometime in the 1200s, that they had a revolution, a revolt against this priestly class and killed them and never allowed hereditary castes or classes to rule over them again, which is kind of interesting. Again, probably unrelated, but this probably just a coincidence, but this is the same time that Cahokia fell in around St. Louis today and sort of mysteriously disappeared. The people left and it became uninhabited by 1300 AD. This is what a Mississippian priest might have looked like about 1,000 years ago. And we know that the Cherokee were influenced by the Mississippian culture at that time. But this is an actual account. This is the Cherokee story of the revolt against the Anikutani, also sometimes written Nikotani or Nikotani. So the people long brooded in silence over the oppressions and outrages of this high caste, whom they deeply hated but greatly feared. At length, a daring young man, a member of an influential family, organized a conspiracy among the people for the massacre of the priesthood. The immediate provocation was the abduction of the wife of the young leader of the conspiracy. His wife was remarkable for her beauty and was forcibly abducted and violated by one of the Nikotani while he was absent on the chase. On his return, he found no difficulty in exciting in others the resentment which he himself experienced. So many had suffered in the same way. So many feared that they might be made to suffer, that nothing was wanted but a leader. A leader appearing in the person of the young brave, whom we have named. I didn't write his name down here. The people rose under his direction and killed every Nikotani, young and old. Thus perished a hereditary secret society, since which time no hereditary privileges have been tolerated among the Cherokee. So I just think that's a really interesting account. This is what the Cherokee themselves told an American about 200 years ago who was living with them and writing down their stories. And so what happened sometime around 1300 AD is that this priestly class, which was hereditary, had become very oppressive and abusive, and were apparently even, you know, raping young women who belonged to the other clans or the other castes. And one of them had had enough and was fed up and launched a revolution that killed all of them and did away with this hereditary class. So the first European contact with the Cherokees was probably the De Soto expedition. Hernan de Soto was a Spanish explorer, and he explored the southeast, along this red line that you see here. And a lot of these names that you see up in here are the names of Cherokee villages that we know he passed by or visited. Unfortunately, it was not a pleasant meeting of the two groups. De Soto's expedition was very violent and abusive, looking for gold, and fought with the Cherokee, and left behind infectious diseases that caused an epidemic and killed many Cherokee, and may have drastically transformed their culture and their society just because of the massive death that resulted from this epidemic. A little later, there was a second Spanish expedition. This is 1567, so about 25 years later. It was led by a guy named Juan Pardo, and he established 6 forts in Cherokee territory. So he was trying to establish a permanent Spanish presence. But when he left, and these are the Cherokee towns he visited and drew maps of. But he left the 6 forts and went back to his base on the coast or in Florida. And while he was gone, the Cherokee attacked and wiped out the 6 forts, killed all but one of the soldiers there. And that was the end of Spanish forts in Cherokee territory. So by 1650, the Cherokee were estimated to have about 22,500 persons. They lived in towns. These were not whatever your images of mobile Indians, plains Indians who chased the buffalo and that sort of thing. The Cherokee were not like that. The Cherokee were farmers who lived in towns. They did go on hunts, but these were like hunting expeditions. The men would leave and go on these long hunts to places like Kentucky, which was a traditional hunting ground for the Cherokee and the Shawnee and other Indians. And then they would come back, laden with animals and skins and stuff. But they claimed a territory of about 40,000 square miles. Like I said, had about 22,500 people. By the 1600s, they are in contact with English colonists who are trading with them. And the English are trading for deer skins mostly. And in exchange, the English are giving the Cherokee iron and steel tools like knives, kettles, also, of course, firearms, gunpowder, ammunition. Those sorts of things are in demand, things that the Cherokee can't produce from themselves. Let's see. So, in the 1700s, the Cherokee and the English had an uneasy relationship. The Cherokee were allied with the English against the Tuscarora, who were another Iroquoian-speaking group in South Carolina. And together, they pushed the Tuscarora out of South Carolina, and they ended up traveling up to around New York State and living with the other Iroquois-speaking groups in the Iroquois Confederation. But the Cherokee, who by the 1730, who let's see, by the 1700s were sending expeditions, not expeditions, diplomatic missions to London, meeting with the king, signing treaties with the king. They had a falling out with the English during the French and Indian War. They started off as allies, and then by the end of the war, they ended up actually fighting each other. And this led to a Cherokee defeat, and was really the beginning of about 50 years or more of conflict between the Cherokee and the English, and the Cherokee and the Americans. Another thing that I have to talk about, very important, around 1738, 1739, a terrible epidemic of smallpox broke out. And this had a huge impact on Cherokee history and indirectly on the United States history, because it wiped out about half the Cherokee people. Remember I said there were something like 22,000 Cherokee people in the mid 1600s. So thousands of people were wiped out. We think hundreds of people committed suicide because of the disfigurement and the suffering that went along with the smallpox epidemic. And we think that the Cherokee culture, in a sense, the society was almost broken. This was so devastating that the entire culture was kind of demoralized by what had happened. One thing of importance to the Cherokee is that after the French and Indian War, and I've mentioned this before in the context of the American Revolution, the King of England tried to draw a line along the top of the Appalachian Mountains and forbid American and English colonists to travel over that line and to settle west of the Appalachians. And this was meant to prevent encroachment on Cherokee lands and other tribal lands, and try to prevent wars between the colonists and the Indians. And of course, it wasn't very successful. In 1776 and 1777, during the American Revolution, the Cherokees were also at war with the Americans. The Cherokees attacked American settlers in the Appalachians, and by 1977, something like 50 Cherokee towns had been wiped out by Americans who were counterattacking. So this was another devastating defeat for the Cherokee. These two people are famous historical figures. The guy on the left is named Dragging Canoe. He was one of the leaders in the war against the Americans in 1776 and 1777. He left with his followers for Chattanooga, Tennessee, and where they kept fighting kind of guerrilla warfare against the Americans for the next, 30 years or so. His niece was named Nancy Ward. She has a Cherokee name, but unfortunately I can't remember it and I didn't write it. Oh, well, I can't read Cherokee. I don't remember how to pronounce that. Nanyehi or something like that. Nanyehi, or Nancy Ward, was famous for convincing many Cherokees, not her uncle Dragging Canoe, but many others, to stop attacking the Americans and to seek peaceful relations with them. The Cherokee just had a play about her or something like that just a year or two ago. So now I'm getting into the 1800s and the era that directly relates to Indian removal. But I wanted to go into all that so you can see that the Cherokee had a long relationship with the English and then the Americans, sometimes allies against other Indians, sometimes at war between the Cherokees and the Americans, or the Cherokees and the English. But now we're in the 1800s. And one of the most interesting people in American history and in Cherokee history is this guy. His name is Sequoyah. And Sequoyah, around 1808, decided to do something truly remarkable. He decided to invent his own system of writing. He had seen American traders writing letters and reading books, and he understood what they were doing. They were reading symbols that corresponded with sounds in their language. And he thought this would be a really useful tool for the Cherokees to have for themselves, and he wanted to make up something like it. So he spent over a decade. He was finished around 1821, 1822, so it took him about 13, 14 years. And he came up with a syllabary, which was a system, not our alphabet where we have 26 letters, but they have something like 60 or 70 signs that stand for syllables in their alphabet, in their language, right? So there's a unique sign for every syllable. Now, what's interesting about this is that initially it's a little harder. You have to learn 70 or so signs instead of just 26. But after you've memorized those signs and the syllables they stand for, it gets really, really easy because you can read very quickly. Unlike English, where you learn the 26 letters, but then there are, who knows how many dozens and dozens of combinations. They sound one way in this word and a different way in the other word. Once you learn the Cherokee syllables that you can see right here, you can pronounce anything effortlessly, perfectly, without almost any confusion. So the Cherokee adopted his system, and they still use it today. And almost overnight, they went from an illiterate nation that didn't know how to read or write, unless they could read or write in English, to a fluent, literate people. They were reading, they were writing, they were publishing their own bilingual newspaper. This is the Cherokee Phoenix. It was published by 1828. They translated the Bible into Cherokee, and they printed the Bible, and they translated hymns like Amazing Grace. And so they went from being non-literate to being almost fully literate within just a couple of decades. So that was pretty interesting. Now, Sequoia, who I just mentioned, and several others, Dragging Canoe, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, this guy, John Jolly, they are a group of people that we call either the Western Cherokee or the Old Settlers. And what that means is simply by the early 1800s, by the 18 teens, these folks had realized or had decided that they had to move west to escape from the rapidly growing American settlements. The settlers were pouring over the Appalachian Mountains. The settlers were pouring into the southeastern states of Georgia and Tennessee and filling up South Carolina and North Carolina. And so these folks first went to Arkansas, where the U.S. government established a reservation for them in 1815. Some of them ended up in Texas and were here in Texas until the 1830s, ended up leaving when they went to war with the Republic of Texas. But these old settlers are historically the ancestors of the Kituwa tribe. It's one of those three official tribes that I mentioned. That tribe traces its origins back to these old settlers who were the first to move west, escaping from the American, wave of settlement. Another interesting thing about the Cherokee, around the time that Sequoia was developing a written language for them, they were coming up with their own national government. And they modeled this on the United States government. They had a bicameral legislature, meaning a House and a Senate. They had courts. They had a legislature. So they created in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, in that area, basically their own modern nation. They had their newspaper. They had everything, right? It was small, only 20,000 people or so, but they were consciously modernizing their system of government and their systems of communication. And they were doing it to some degree in order to get along better with the Americans. They figured if we modernize ourselves, then we'll get along better with these American settlers who are filling up our lands. Some of the leaders in this process, James Vann is the guy on the upper left, And the guy on the upper right was called different things over the course of his life, which was common for Indians. The Ridge is how I identify him here, and that seems to be the most common identifier. He was also sometimes called Path Killer and other things. One interesting thing about these guys, I should say this now before I forget. These were, especially these two men, Van and the Ridge, they were leaders in the effort to form a national government. They were leaders in the effort to modernize. They worked and lived very much like their southern white neighbors. They had slaves. They had plantations. If you went into a Cherokee house, if you visited, and you can, if you visit James Van's house, it looks like a southern plantation home, very much. With the only difference being he was an Indian instead of an American. So Indian removal. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. It authorized the president to grant lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders. President Jackson said the removal policy was an effort to prevent the Cherokee from facing extinction, which he said was the fate of the Mohegan, the Narragansett, and the Delaware. These were the Indians of the northeastern states. By the end of Jackson's presidency, his administration had negotiated almost 70 removal treaties, and these led to the relocation of nearly 50,000 Eastern Indians to the Indian Territory that later became Oklahoma. And it opened up 25 million acres of land to white settlement and to the expansion of slavery. Yes, sir?
That's where the highest population today is still, right? Is that Oklahoma?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, there are other large populations. There's a lot of Indians in the New Mexico, Arizona area, and in places like South Dakota, Montana. But I'm pretty sure the most concentrated group of Indians and the biggest population of Indians is still in Oklahoma. I'm almost positive. Yeah, great question. So, a couple of things about this. What's interesting is Jackson, I read his speech to Congress where he asks for this, and it's an interesting speech, arguably very hypocritical, but interesting. He says that only movement west of the Mississippi River to the Indian Territory will save the Cherokee from cultural extinction. And he is predicting, it's a very pessimistic prediction, that if they stay, there will be warfare and conflict with the Americans and they will be destroyed. Just like the Indians in Virginia were destroyed by their conflicts with Jamestown, and just like the Indians in New England were destroyed in King Philip's War and their conflict with the Puritans. He says if we move them west, we're saving them from destruction at our own hands, which is an interesting argument. But there's another thing to consider. The act didn't say, well, let me ask you this. If you're a Cherokee living in Georgia, under the Cherokee Nation, your own court, your own legislature, your own, and you say, I don't want to go. Is there a way you could not go? Is there a way you could avoid going? Yes, yes. Renounce your Cherokee citizenship, accept American citizenship, and acknowledge that you are now a citizen of the state of Georgia and of the United States, and that Cherokee means nothing to you, right? You're not a tribal member anymore. So they could have stayed if they announced that they were dissolving their tribal governments and that they were no longer a separate political tribal entity. They were just ordinary Georgians and Tennesseans like everyone else, subject to the laws of Georgia and the laws of Tennessee. Now, there were lots of reasons why that was unpalatable to them. Most importantly, they wanted to rule themselves. They had done so for thousands of years. They wanted to keep doing so. But this was kind of a demand. This was kind of a demand from Congress and Jackson. If you want to be a separate nation, you have to do it somewhere else. You can't do it within the territorial bounds of the United States. I wanted to point all that out because it'll help you to understand the Eastern Band in North Carolina in just a minute. Okay, so the Cherokee had a lot of fights with Georgia. This is where some of the most heated arguments were. Sometime around 1828, Georgia extended its state laws over the Cherokee tribe. In other words, it declared all Cherokee laws and customs null and void. So this is the Cherokee Nation within Georgia, right? In the upper kind of northwest corner of Georgia was where the Cherokee territory was. And so Georgia was saying, your government is null and void. We don't recognize its validity. And no laws that you passed are legitimate laws. You are subject to Georgia laws completely, and end of story. All right. So the Cherokee challenged this in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said something very interesting. It said that the Cherokee and all Indian tribes were something called domestic dependent nations. And if you are interested in Indian law or Indian history in particular, this phrase is a very important one because this is legally, constitutionally, this is the way it is all the way till today. This is still current. Indian tribes are not states like Texas and Oklahoma. Indian tribes are not nations like Canada, France, Mexico, but they are something, right? They are some kind of a government, and the Supreme Court recognized that they were something. They were some kind of a legitimate government, so it called them domestic dependent nations. And the idea was Congress can rule over them, is what the Supreme Court came up with, but not states. States have no authority to rule over them. Now, in this particular case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the court didn't issue any kind of ruling. It backed off. It said it didn't have jurisdiction over this case. We don't need to worry about that. But this case was really interesting. Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester was a Christian missionary, Samuel Worcester. And he, like many Christian missionaries, was living amongst the Cherokee. And Georgia passed a law saying that no white American could go on tribal land without a license from the state of Georgia. And if they violated the law, if they trespassed, they could be punished with up to 4 years in prison. And so he violated the law. And they arrested him, and he went to prison. And prison in Georgia in the 1830s was probably a terrible place to be. Now, why do you think they wanted to pass a law forbidding Christian missionaries like him from traveling on Indian lands? To protect the Indians? No. It's very unlikely that they cared about protecting the Indians, right? So what are they afraid of? What's he doing that they don't want to happen? Well, one answer is obvious. It jumps right at you. He's Christianizing the Indians, right? That's what he's there for. Why would they not want that?
Maybe because then the public would see it as more
sympathetic. Yeah. Then one argument for treating them like garbage goes away. You can no longer say, well, they're heathens, they're savages. If they're now living in towns, well, they've been living in towns, but they're going to churches like everybody else. All the distinctions that you use to discriminate against them are falling away. So that's one reason. Another reason, that's good, is he and these other Christian missionaries were helping them get printing presses and use the presses to print newspapers, to print books, to print Bibles. He was educating the Indians. He was helping them to educate themselves, is probably a better way to put it. And a lot of these Christian missionaries were also very active in helping the Cherokee and other Indians understand the American court system and use it to fight back against states like Georgia. And so these missionaries were, in other words, they were trying to help. And they were trying to help the Indians, and Georgia wanted to stop that. So they arrested him. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that this Georgia law was unconstitutional because of the reason I said, that states can't legislate over Indian tribes. Unfortunately, Worcester had to stay in prison for a while because Georgia just ignored the Supreme Court and said, we don't care what you say, and just left him in jail anyway until they could work out basically a compromise between his side and theirs. But this was very important, again, as precedent for this idea that states like Oklahoma can't just pass laws however they like without regards to Indian sovereignty. So John Ross was the principal chief of the Cherokee tribe in 1828 and remained so for many years. He became a leader in the battle against removal from their homes in the Southeast, and he became the leader of a group that we'll sometimes call the National Party. So this is Ross, and these are the groups that are in favor of staying in the Southeast, and they fought against people who were either called the Treaty Party or sometimes the Ridge Party, named after the ridge, major ridge that I mentioned just a few slides ago. By the mid-1830s, all of the tribes in the Southeast, except the Cherokee, had signed treaties agreeing to removal. The Treaty Party, led by Major Ridge and some others, believed that removal was inevitable, that it was going to happen, and that it was just folly to fight against it. And they feared that if the Cherokee were obstinate and just refused to go and refused to sign any treaty, sooner or later a war would happen and they would be removed by force and they would get nothing. They would get no compensation for their land, no money. And so they thought we'd better take whatever deal we can get and sign whatever treaty we can sign just to accept the inevitable. And so the Treaty Party signed in 1835 the Treaty of New Echota. There were 75 Cherokees who signed the treaty, including the Ridge, who I mentioned a few slides ago. He was the leader of this group. His son, I think, signed as well, other prominent figures. They signed in exchange for $5 million and other supplies, promises, and so forth. And however, these 75 did not represent a majority of the Cherokee people. There were some 16,000 Cherokees. Most of them were against signing any treaties. So this was a minority. And they were not actually the recognized government of the Cherokee people. John Ross was the recognized president of the Cherokee. So it was highly dubious, this treaty. From the Cherokee point of view, from the point of view of John Ross and most Cherokees, it was just illegal. And it was actually violated an 1819 Cherokee law that made it a capital crime to sell tribal lands. In other words, the death sentence, if you tried to sell any tribal land. Nevertheless, this treaty was used. It was put into force. The American Army under Winfield Scott used 3,000 soldiers to round up about 16,000 Cherokees, and during the fall and winter of 1838 and 1839, they were removed to Indian Territory. Some of them had to walk as much as 1,000 miles over this 4-month period, and approximately 4,000 of them died on the way, 1 out of every 4. The Cherokees also took their slaves. Those of them who did have slaves, something like 7% of Cherokee families were slave owners. I think it was 7%. And the slaves went with them, which is, in the past, that was a sometimes ignored aspect of the story, but the slaves suffered and endured just like everybody else did. Now, what do you think happened when they got to Oklahoma? And but in terms of this rivalry, this disagreement. Not quite that dramatic, but yes, equally deadly. So what happened was the leaders of the Treaty Party in 1839 were assassinated. They were all just murdered. And this was clearly in retribution for signing the treaty. They were, I read about this, gosh, 30 years ago, so my memory may be failing me. But the assassinations were timed. It was like a scene from The Godfather or something. Like they were timed to all be basically simultaneous, so no one could warn the others about what was happening. But Major Ridge, John Ridge, his son, another famous Indian named Cherokee named Elias Boudinot, John Van, who I showed you a picture of a little earlier, they were all basically simultaneously executed by Cherokees from the other side who were angry at the over the Treaty of New Echota. Now, back in North Carolina, about 1,000 Cherokees stayed. They accepted the dissolution of their government. They accepted North Carolina's authority over them and became American citizens. And for, gosh, 100 years or so, they lived a poor life in the southwestern corner of North Carolina in their ancestral homeland, but just like all the other North Carolinian Southerners. Sometime in the early 1900s, they slowly and painstakingly began to reconstitute their government. And like I said, a few thousand of them still live there today. Now, the blood settling, the feuds didn't quite end. When the Civil War broke out, a little over 20 years after the removal, the Cherokee split. In other words, the Civil War in the United States was also kind of a civil war among the Cherokee people. Most of the Cherokees supported the South. They formed Confederate armies. The leader of the Cherokee Confederates was undoubtedly this man. His name was Stand Watie. He was one of the Treaty Party Indians who escaped assassination. And during the Civil War, this was a North Carolina Cherokee. Stand Watie was the most prominent Confederate Cherokee in Oklahoma. This man was the most prominent Cherokee in North Carolina. His name was William Holland Thomas. But during the Civil War in Oklahoma, people took advantage of the fact that the Civil War was going on to settle feuds, and Watie was still angry at John Ross and the others who had killed his friends and his family members back in 1839, and he chased them out of Oklahoma, basically. So it wasn't until after the Civil War that all of the bloodshed and all of the hatred that arose out of the Indian removal process finally began to settle down and began to go away. And that's where I'll stop for today. So I'll see you next time.